As we turn right now to Yemen, we turn to Yemen because, well, a Saudi-led airstrike killed 36 civilians working at a bottling plant in the northern province of Hajjah on Sunday. Another attack on the Yemeni capital, Sana'a, hit a house and killed 4 civilians. The news comes amidst new evidence the Saudi-led forces have used cluster munitions in Yemen. Human Rights Watch said it found U.S.-made cluster munition rockets likely used in at least 7 attacks in Hajjah between late April and mid-July. Dozens of civilians were killed or wounded, both during the attacks and later, when they picked up unexploded submunitions that detonated. Neither the United States, Saudi Arabia, or Yemen have joined the global convention banning the use of cluster munitions. Yesterday, I spoke to Human Rights Watch Executive Director Kenneth Roth and started by asking him what Human Rights Watch found in Yemen.
As you note, the fact that the relevant countries have not ratified the Cluster Munitions Treaty, while it would be helpful to do so, it's not decisive, because all of them have ratified the Geneva Conventions, which prohibit indiscriminate warfare. And cluster munitions are, by definition, indiscriminate. They scatter over wide areas, so they should never be used in civilian-populated areas to begin with. Plus, they leave a residue. Not every munition explodes on contact with the ground, and they become anti-personnel landmines for people to just stumble upon and die. So the U.S. should be using pressure on the Saudis not to be using these weapons at all, but certainly not to be using them in populated areas, whereas we're seeing Yemenis are being killed.
Explain what these weapons are and what they do.
They're essentially area denial weapons. There is a canister with, upwards of 200 submunitions, little bombs inside. The canister opens in the sky and spreads these submunitions over a wide area. Each one of those is lethal. So you don't want to be in that area as these things rain down on you. You also don't want to walk through that area afterwards, because it becomes effectively a landmine field, because these cluster munitions are unreliable, and a significant number don't initially explode. They only explode later when somebody touches them or stands on them.
How do they affect the human body?
They're devastating. They're like standing on a landmine. They at minimum, will rip off your limbs, and they very frequently are completely lethal.
I want to turn to a video released by Human Rights Watch featuring interviews with victims of cluster munitions in Yemen.
We were together and a rocket hit us. It exploded in the air and cluster bombs, submunitions, fell out of it. Before we left the house with the sheep, 2 submunitions fell down while others spread all over the village. One exploded and the other still remains. My cousin and I were wounded.
3 brothers were killed, 2 children and 1 adult. It hit us while we were sleeping, and we were all wounded, including my brothers. I can't walk. My mother carries me. She gets me out, washes me, as well as my brother. My whole body is wounded. My dress was burned that night. My hands were burned, and my bones were broken.
Those were victims of cluster munitions in Yemen. Ken Roth is executive director of Human Rights Watch, which put out this video. So talk about what Saudi Arabia is doing right now in Yemen.
Well, Saudi Arabia is leading a coalition which is fighting the Houthi rebel forces in Yemen, and it's repeatedly using indiscriminate forms of warfare. A big part of the problem has been these cluster munitions, but we've seen time and time again that even more targeted weapons are being targeted in the wrong place. These are sophisticated weapons. The Saudis should be able to target them only at military targets, but we're finding often that they're not, and that's why we're seeing such a significant civilian toll.
So they're being used to terrorize?
They're being used at least without much care as to who is hit. There is a sense that, particularly in the northern areas, which are predominantly Houthi, that there's not so much concern about civilians.
I mean, the U.S. just sealed a deal with Saudi Arabia for military weapons and jets. That's the largest deal in the world.
The U.S. obviously views Saudi Arabia as a major supporter of the U.S. military complex, and airplane producers and the like need these contracts, think they need these contracts in order to continue to be profitable. That shouldn't be happening at the expense of civilians on the ground. The U.S. should be willing to live by the principles that it has theoretically signed up for in the Geneva Conventions and ensure that anybody it sells arms to is not using those arms to indiscriminately kill civilians, as the Saudis have been doing.
Human Rights Watch is calling for a UN inquiry into violations on all sides in Yemen?
Absolutely. In fact, there is a conference coming up reviewing compliance with the new cluster munitions treaty. And one of the problems is that the UK, Canada, and Australia, all of which have joined the cluster munitions treaty, are pushing to water down this inquiry. They're trying to put allegedly in front of the evidence we have that Saudi clusters have killed civilians in Yemen. They're doing the U.S. bidding.
Why does the U.S. want to water this down?
Well, I mean, the U.S. thinks that cluster munitions are legitimate weapons. The U.S. still hasn't signed on to the Landmines Treaty. So the U.S. is very much behind the rest of the world, as most nations of the world want to ban these inherently indiscriminate weapons. The U.S. has a huge arsenal of them. It doesn't want that arsenal limited, and it hates the idea of treaties that are restraining the Pentagon on humanitarian grounds. It lives with the Geneva Conventions because it understands that those help to fight a better war. But the add-ons that Human Rights Watch and others have pressed, the Landmines Treaty, the Cluster Munitions Treaty, and the like, the Pentagon hates and has prevented Obama from signing on to them and is trying to undermine enforcement using U.S. allies around the world to do that.
How much difference does mass protest make around something like this?
I think it makes all the difference in the world. In other words, Obama doesn't want to be seen as underwriting indiscriminate warfare, even if it is on the other side of the world. If it happens under the radar screen, if the Pentagon is able to push this quietly, there's no big political cost to Obama. But I think rabble-rousing and publicity helps make Obama responsible, and he's going to have a hard time standing up and saying, I don't really care about indiscriminate warfare.
Just to be clear, the Landmine Treaty that the U.S. also has not signed on to, that's the one that Princess Di was pushing so many years ago, right, among many other people.
Precisely. And in fact, the U.S. government has limited the use of landmines. And even though it hasn't joined on to the treaty, it recognizes that these are weapons that are extremely difficult to use because of public relations problems. And so there has been a real shift at the Pentagon. We haven't seen that shift yet in any significant way with cluster munitions. So
you have this situation where people are being struck, civilians are being struck by cluster munitions, by the Saudi-led attacks on Yemen. Yet Saudi Arabia continues to lead a blockade against people leaving. Can you explain what's happening there?
Well, there's an enormous humanitarian crisis in Yemen. It is already a country that is very dependent on international assistance for basic things like water and the like. And because the Saudis have been blockading the country, trying to prevent fuel and other things from getting into Yemen as part of its effort to fight the Houthi rebels, the Yemeni people are suffering. And we're seeing enormous numbers of people who are facing malnutrition and even starvation because of the deprivation caused by this blockade. I mean, the figures are amazing. According to the UN, 21 million Yemenis, a staggering 80% of the population need assistance, and half the population is facing hunger, famine. More than 15.2 million people lack access to basic health care, and over 20 million lack access to safe water. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely horrendous, and it really underscores the importance of making clear that if you're going to go to war, yes, you shoot at the other side's combatants, but you can't use means that cause the entire civilian population to suffer. And that's what the Saudi-led coalition is doing in Yemen today. Human Rights Watch Executive Director Ken Roth speaking.